Hi, my name is Paige McCullough, and this video talks about my interview essay with my grandfather and how Agent Orange has affected his life. My research explores a critical yet overlooked perspective, the ethical and psychological toll on the American scientists drafted to develop the chemical program Operation Ranch Hand. This isn't just a historical footnote, it's deeply personal. My work is anchored in the life and experiences of my own grandfather, a young scientist whose intellect was weaponized by the U.S. government. My core thesis is that for men like my grandfather, the quiet lab became a sterile prison where scientific rigor was corrupted by military goals, transforming their professional contribution into a profound act of moral complicity. My research first began with three specific questions. First, how did the draft transform these scientists into instruments of war, and what was the initial psychological impact? My grandfather's story provides the answer, a crippling mix of anger, helplessness, and a deep sense of duty. Second, what specific ethical concerns did these scientists face while working on Agent Orange? This is where his work in the lab becomes so revealing. The red flags they raised about the chemical's toxicity were ignored in the pursuit of military objectives. And finally, what were the enduring, long-term scars of this service? I'm not just talking about the guilt, I'm talking about the physical manifestations, the health issues that appeared decades later. To answer these, my research process was twofold. I relied heavily on oral history, conducting extensive interviews with my grandfather. I then cross-referenced his memories with documentation about Operation Ranch Hand and the USA EHA to provide historical context and verification. In this video, I'm going to get into before, during, and after his service spent working in a lab for developing Agent Orange. After graduating college, my grandfather was inducted. He recounts the constant dread of being sent to the jungle to fight a deeply unpopular war. This era was one of limited choices. The draft felt like a death sentence. But due to his specialty in entomology and plant pathology, he was diverted from the front line. His body was trained for combat, but his mind was needed for the lab at Edgewater Arsenal. This move replaced the fear of direct combat with the particular tension of institutional secrecy. The mission was to develop a wettable powder using the compound that would become known as Agent Orange. The goal was purely strategic, to penetrate the jungle's canopy so the U.S. forces could spot the enemy's movements. My grandfather had all kinds of different things to say about testing and other things that he did, including Agent Orange. But one thing that he said was, "These chemicals were seen in a very positive light at the time. We did not know that the effects on humans would be so drastic." But even in the quiet lab, red flags were showing. Environmental tests showed that the fish were dying around the testing sites, and animal experiments involving dogs and monkeys confirmed their toxic suspicions. The irony was devastating. He was serving his country by optimizing the dispersal of a chemical cocktail that he inherently mistrusted. The chemicals were inescapable. He shared a story of his colonel chewing and swallowing a pellet to prove it was harmless to a nervous pilot, an act of arrogance that summarized the military's denial of its toxicity. For my grandfather, the chemical left a physical stain. Years later, he developed skin patches on his legs, now known as Agent Orange tattoos. The Agent Orange tattoos weren't the only physical scar from working on Agent Orange. Prostate cancer has been directly linked to being in contact with the chemical compound. My grandfather developed this cancer later in life due to all the work he did around these chemicals. The work wasn't limited to defoliants. He also conducted studies with hallucinogens on soldiers who were promised a 3-day pass. As he recounted, he met one of these medical volunteers later in his life. He was struck by the knowledge that this man was still being tested and monitored for the lasting effects of the compounds they administered. But going back to his service, after 2 years, he refused an immediate officer's commission, choosing to leave the service. His relief was short-lived, though, as he and other veterans were often met with hostility and resentment from a public that associated them with everything bad about the war. My grandfather's story is a crucial addition to the Vietnam War narrative. It shifts the focus from the battlefield to the moral battleground that existed within the American military-industrial complex. I have 3 takeaways. First, the draft nullifies choice. The system eliminated personal autonomy, forcing intellectual and ethical compromise. These scientists, who otherwise would have pursued peaceful careers, were bound against their will to the creation of destruction. Second, war corrupts science. This research demonstrates how military imperatives override scientific evidence. Warnings about toxicity were suppressed because the tactical goal, denying enemy cover, was considered paramount. Third, moral wounds are permanent. My grandfather's service in a quiet lab left scars, emotional, psychological, and physical, that were as deep and enduring as those forged in a combat zone. His prostate cancer, his skin blotches, and the complex feelings about his own complicity are a lifelong burden. By sharing his story, we honor the moral complexity and personal sacrifice of those who were never meant to be soldiers, but whose lives were irrevocably marked by their unwilling contribution to the machinery of war. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.